Welcome, everybody, and this is a new episode of our never-ending journal club. And today we're discussing a paper by Tsuchiya, Burza, Yamada, Saigo, and Potos, Quantum-like Qualia hypothesis from quantum cognition to quantum perception. And so we will have a short round of introduction, and then we will start discussing the paper. My name is Francesco Ellia. I'm a postdoc at ATR and a adjunct research associate at Monash University, and my background is primarily in philosophy and philosophy of science. Anson?
My name's
Qianchen.
okay. My name's Qianchen, and I'm currently a PhD student at Tsuchiya Lab, Monash University, Australia. My background is mostly on psychophysics.
Hello everyone, my name is Anson and I'm from the same university as Qianchen at Monash and under again the same Tsuchiya lab. I'm currently a research intern looking to start my PhD in the near future, and at the moment I'm exploring a whole bunch of topics regarding qualia and consciousness, and that's why I'm here. Yeah.
I'll go next. I'm Angus. I'm a postdoc. I'm opposite to Francesco, so I'm a postdoc now at Monash and have this extra thing with ATR. So yeah.
I guess I'll go. I'm Zoe. I'm a PhD student at UCLA working with Dr. Martin Monti and also with now it's Chia. My background is in cognitive science and computational modeling, getting more into psychophysics.
And my name is Mike. I am from the same Tsuchiya lab. I'm a PhD student who specializes in quantum cognitions. I will be your presenter for today. If it's all right, I shall start to share my PowerPoint. Share. Hope everyone can see it. Yes, great. So, quantum-like Qualia hypothesis from Tsuchiya and colleague 2025. Now, it's a new theory hypothesis to understand and characterize qualia. Now, the question, of course, is, don't we already have a theory that help us quantify and characterize qualia? I'm sure people from this lab would be quite familiar how we quantify qualia in metric space. The distance in this three-dimensional or two-dimensional space is often based on similarities. But however, there are issues with this kind of, I guess, traditional way of characterizing qualia. Namely, three aspects of qualias are not accounted for by this theory. Namely, the temporal dynamic of qualia. Qualia is changing from seconds to seconds, right? And also, it doesn't really tell us anything, well, tell us much about the interaction between qualia and other mental processes. Could be expectation, could be attention, could be memories, whichever one you like. And at the end, this is perhaps the most radical part of the quantum-like Qualia hypothesis, that perhaps some aspect of qualia is indeterminate. We will begin by talking about the first two, and then we will separately talk about the last one. Now, for the first two, it's good to begin with some kind of examples. Imagine you are a researcher in color similarity. You invite a participant in, you show them two color simultaneously, maybe for 100 milliseconds, let's say. And then you ask them, oh, are these similar or dissimilar? And they say, oh, very dissimilar. You put all the results through multi-dimensional scaling, you get something like this. Each point represents some kind of color experience. And the distance between one point to another representing their similarity or dissimilarity, right? We see green clustered together, red kind of clustered together, so on and so forth. Now, this is pretty informative. It tells quite a lot about the structure of color experience. But there are some issues that became very obvious when you think about it. First, we are showing participant 100 milliseconds of the color. We're not taking into account color adaptations. But in reality, in real life, adaptations happens all the time, right? And it changes seconds by seconds based on how much you are looking at the same thing, how often you move your head or eyes, so on and so forth. And of course, what happens when the colors are not presented simultaneously? I mean, we don't see all 9 colors at the same time. We see a subset of them, and then we turn our heads and we see something else, right? What happens with expectations, right? We are not most often expecting to see the color purple, but maybe bluish or greenish color, we have a much higher expectations to see. This is not represented in our color similarity experiments, nor is it represented in this color structure. And of course, attentions. Our attention changes, once again, from seconds to seconds, and it doesn't really tell us anything about how it interacts with our attentions. So when we think about all these different aspects, this static 3-dimensional representation of color doesn't seem to be doing a very good job. It would be nice if some kind of qualia hypothesis came along and resolved these problems, of course. But before that, we also need to talk about indeterminate nature of qualia. What do I mean by that? Well, we'll start with the question, are we always certain about all aspects of our experience? It seems we are certain about most aspects, but perhaps not always. An example given by the authors were the spatial and temporal boundaries of our experience. If we think about the temporal boundaries, all our experience have some kind of durations, but the boundary of it seems a little fuzzy if we were to introspect exactly when did the experience begin and end. The same can be said about spatial boundaries, right? We can make some rough estimates about it, but in context, like for example, in total darkness, all of a sudden, like where such boundary begin or end became extremely uncertain. Now, there are in fact 2 types of indeterminacy, according to the authors. There's the epistemic one, where we are uncertain due to a lack of information. So perhaps, for example, the spatial boundaries, maybe we're just not good at introspecting it, right? Maybe we don't have enough information. That's why we are uncertain. It's a possibility. But they also want to argue for something more drastic, more revolutionary, let's say. The ontic indeterminacy, where we are uncertain because the experience is indefinitive prior to measurements. So maybe I can provide an example for this. Imagine you're eating something sweet, and of course, you introspect how sweet it is. So before the moment of introspection, there is no specific level of sweetness. It doesn't exist, according to this ontological ontic indeterminacies. But the moment you do the introspection, or someone else asks you about the sweetness, you force yourself into a single specific level of sweetness. It's very sweet, or it's not sweet at all. So the idea is something like that. Now, we're going back to the quantum qualia hypothesis. According to the authors, the QQ hypothesis resolves all 3 problems, right? But what is quantum qualia hypothesis? Now, quantum qualia hypothesis, the fundamental, divide the observable from state, or rather state from observables. What is observables? It's what we are trying to observe. In this case, qualia, right? And the state refers to the state of measurement, describe the context of how, when, what we're conducting the measurement with. Now imagine a cup of water. Let's say we're trying to measure its temperature. The temperature of the water is, of course, the observable. The state of the measurement would be, for example, what kind of thermostats are we using, the temperature of the thermostats when we insert it into the water, for how long do we put the thermostats in, so on and so forth. That would be the state the context of the measurements. Now, QQ hypotheses argue that both can change through the use of something called the instrument. We'll talk a bit about that later. But the idea of the instrument is it provides an easy way to dynamically update the observable and the state, resolving the temporal dynamic issue we mentioned before. So at the end, it looks something like this. The qualia is at the center, and surrounding it is the state, right? We have sensory inputs as a part of the states. We have attention as part of the states. And it forms some kind of an interface, if you will, where the information flow from the external world, it contributes to qualia, and then it goes through this interface before it can even influence qualia. And of course, when the person is trying to report their experience, it also goes through the same interface, right? So we can see that the act of reporting, based on this little arrow, it can in fact in some way influence the qualia itself because it goes through this interface. We also have a rough example of an instrument. The author didn't really specify a specific version. There's not a lot of constraint to the instrument, but essentially it's just a function that takes the current qualia experience, QT, and the current attentional states, as well as the sensory input states, and it can tell you what happens in the next seconds, next time point of qualia, as well as the attentional states. So it can change both the observable and the states. So that's quite nice. Now, why quantum qualia hypothesis beyond just these strategical advantages of resolving our problems? Are there any real similarities between a quantum objects and the qualia? Well, there are some, in fact. We'll start from the more mathematical ones, I suppose. First, it's the complementarity, the argument that not all qualia can be experienced simultaneously. Now, the correspondence in physics, in quantum mechanics, is something like Heisenberg uncertainty principles, where we can only know one aspect of the physical object, one properties at the time, and we can't know the other corresponding aspect to it. So perhaps the same can be applied to qualia. Like we can, for example, binocular rivalry, right? We know that in some cases, we can actually see both images projected to both eyes, but in some cases, we can only see one and then switch to the other and then switch back. So perhaps in that case, we would say it's not complementary if we can only see one at a time. So we know that can happen. Also, the non-commutative properties of qualia, that order has something to do with our experience, right? What we see first matters, what we see second matters. For example, the mask. If you're doing psychophysics, you may be quite familiar with backward masking. You show participant something quickly, a letter maybe, and then you insert the mask immediately afterwards. And the participant have difficulties reporting the letter that they see. But if you switch the position of the mask and the letter, all of a sudden participant have no difficulties. So we know that the order matters. Same thing apply to quantum objects. Think about linear algebra, matrix multiplication. The order matters as in a fundamental way to quantum objects. And of course, we talked about this already, uncertainty, indeterminacy, whatever words you will use for it. It applies for both quantum object and qualia. And beyond the mathematical similarities, we also have some philosophical ones, according to the authors. The idea that perhaps qualia defies concrete and definitive representation, at least in some cases. I don't fully grasp the purpose of the argument, but they did mention it, so I'm going to also mention it here. We can talk about it later. Now, some real experiments. We talked about the hypothetical series of the quantum-like qualia a lot, but what about real experiments? We'll start with the order effect, right? The non-communicative properties of qualia. We already talked about this color similarities experiment where we show participants using simultaneously. And we ask what happens if we don't show them simultaneously. Maybe something looks like this, right? We show them one color, 250 milliseconds, wait a bit, and then we show them a second color. Then we ask, oh, what's the similarity? What happens then? Turns out there are order effects for these pairs of colors when participants are judging similarities, right? So maybe when the participants see red first and purple second, or magenta second, they have a different result if they see magenta first and then the red second. They provide different similarity ratings. Now, it presents a problem for this static description of color similarity, namely that in this three-dimensional space, we already assumed that the distance from one to the another point is always the same, which point you start at, right? From red to magenta is the same as from magenta to red. But order effect seems to be telling us that this is quite an incorrect way to characterize our color experience, or at the very least, it's an incomplete ways. So that's that. Also, second aspect, we also have something about Bell's inequality. Now we talk about uncertainty and indeterminacy, and from the naive perspective, you may say that, is this thing real? I mean, this ontic uncertainty seems rather esoteric, right? Is there a way to concretely prove that such uncertainty exists? Here we do have a way, in fact, called Bell's inequality that they used to use it in quantum mechanics. Now we can borrow it for our quantum-like qualia hypothesis. Now, the idea is that, well, if I have to put it simply, that if all the probability are definitive and are not influenced by our measurements, they must follow certain statistical rules. They cannot violate it if they are certain and not influenced by our measurements. Something like this, perhaps. We look at each circle representing a probability. We have the PR, the big circle, minus the PRC, so the little area, and the RL, this area. And then add back up these two. We have to get something like this just by look at it geometrically, right? We have to obtain some result like this. Now, because we know that there must be some kind of result, it must be larger or equal to 0. Probably larger, sometimes equal to. However, experimentally, this may not always be the case. So for example, in 2023, I believe, they conducted a multi-feature experiment where they give participants a face and they ask about the trustworthiness, the dominant, the intelligent about the face. It's simple yes and no answers. So the probability distribution is fairly clear. You either say yes or you say no, right? So in this example, we can apply the same equation to it, right? We can say the trustworthiness is the T, dominance is D, and intelligence is the I. And there seems to be some kind of preliminary evidence that seems to suggest that this is in fact smaller than 0 in their experiment, which violates Bell's inequality and potentially suggests that the underlying probability is not as definitive as one would first imagine. Of course, there are arguments against it. You could say that, oh, no, this is more like a cognitive experiment. It's not actually a real experience about your qualia, let's say. Maybe. Or you may try to form an argument about, oh, there's some kind of hidden variable between these consecutive measurements that are in some way influence the underlying result in a crude and non-quantum way. It's possible. But at least we are starting at a point where we are trying to show the Bell's inequality can be violated. And maybe the qualia is ontologically indeterminate in some way. Now we can also do it through multi-stable perception. Maybe I will not go into it too deeply now, but you can construct a temporal version of the Bell's inequality. And let's say there are 3 time points, right? Time point 1, time point 2, time point 3. And Bell's inequality in this version, you can have an equation something like this, right? The conjunction probability of point 1 and point 2 plus point 2 and point 3 should be larger or equal to point 1 or point 3. So imagine you are seeing a Necker's cube, right? And the Necker's cube automatically flip from one percept to another just by looking at it. It's a little bit like binocular rivalry, if you will. So you look at the Necker's cube at time point 1, maybe it's a plus, so it's this percept. Time point 2, it remains, time point 3 remains. But maybe in time point 3, as we can see in the second example, it flips to a different percept. Now, if we think about the total probability, the total possible case in these 3 time points, there are 8 total possibilities, right? The cube can be in 2 states. There are 3 time points, 2 to the power of 3, 8 time points listed here, right? If we just look at it and the conjunction probability, so the numbers of T1 and T3 covers these 4 points as shown by the axis down here. And then we consider the sum of the probability T1, T2, as well as T2, T3. And we can see the axis, the sum of the axis definitively covers the cases of T1, T3, right? We see this case covered by T2, T3, this case covered by T1, T2. So if we sum these 2 up, we almost certainly get a number larger or equal to T1, T3 over here, which is what motivated this Bell's inequality here. Now, most of this temporal Bell exists in some kind of hypothetical. Recently, there has been an experiment that showed some possibilities that such a temporal Bell exists. We can talk about that later. But yes, you can use temporal Bell experiment through multi-stable perception. And of course, we talk about the non-communicative, we talked about indeterminacy, we haven't talked about complementarity. And we can test that by using a dual task experiment. Now, we know that dual task experiment manipulate attention. It's obvious, right? The participants are doing 2 tasks. Obviously, they are distributing attention differently to each task. So let's say, imagine a difficult letter discrimination task in the central vision. And in the peripheral, you're asked to do these 2 tasks, right? Maybe you're asked to judge which circle it is, right? We have circle here, or maybe you ask to judge which gender the face is, right? What experiment has shown is that the face judgment, gender judgment is very easy, well, relatively easy for the participant, but the circle judgment suddenly very difficult, even though, of course, the participants are distributing attention roughly equally in each condition, right? They all face the same difficult letter discrimination task in the middle, which occupies most of their attention resources. So the previous theory have difficulty explaining exactly what's happening here, but maybe QQ can provide a better explanations, right? Perhaps QQ suggests that some of these observables are incompatible with the letter discrimination task. So for example, maybe, let's say the face is an easier observable when combined with the letter discrimination task, comparing to the circles. That may be able to partially explain it. And maybe we can even conceptualize attention as something that can bring incompatible pairs of observable into compatible ones. So maybe that's the magic of attention. So of course, it wouldn't always work. Can only works from time in some unique cases. The author haven't described exactly what cases it should work on, but it's an interesting and new way to look at attention, which gives us much bigger room for experiment. And just to cap off everything, well, we'll summarize the quantum qualia hypothesis using the following quote. The classical approach assumes that qualia can be probed, observed, and measured without affecting them. But to consider a more general mathematical structure, perhaps it is more useful to start with the assumption that such measurements necessarily affect qualia in some fashion. And that's the end of my summary. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That was outstanding, and I think very in-depth for the for the standard level of summaries that we had so far. That was almost like a talk, and actually I will probably suggest to have the automatic summary from the transcript, because I think that's was so good that it could be very useful for a lot of people. All right, so does anyone has comment, questions, observation, anything that want to discuss? Observation, that's a joke. No one. Okay. Almost.
No, I got it.
Right. Thank you. Angus, you were about to say something?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. So they describe this quantum qualia hypothesis, and I don't know the significance of the use of the term quantum, but it sounds like the main focus is this idea of measurement, right? That you can't really, or maybe you can't measure qualia without affecting it. So I was just wondering, maybe at a really high level, without going into the details, what the significance of the use of describing it as quantum qualia hypothesis as opposed to some other more like measurement effect hypothesis or something like that. Like, is there something specific about the quantum part, or is it because the quantum the existing math for quantum probability or whatever is already providing the framework to describe everything to do with this measurement idea?
I guess so. I mean, at least that's my understanding. Like, they I think so. If I can also do some kind of improvised psychology, I guess that's the main reason. But then probably also it sounds catchy and unique, and I think nowadays this sometimes is a factor when you pick the name, right? So not in a bad way, you know, like I'm truly mean that, but obviously the main reason is that this fits very well with the overall framework that is already existing. And at the same time, what I just said, that the name is also sound cool and also abbreviating QQ, right? That's pretty nice, right? But it also has the downside that it can be accumulated, do you say that? Like, or put together in the same bracket with what we can call quantum theories of consciousness, which is something completely different in return, because that's also something that confused me the very first time I heard about this, because I thought this had something to do with that family of theories, but it's actually I would say it's very interesting because it doesn't imply that, but it also does not prevent that, I guess. So it's completely agnostic in that sense, but it does not imply, for example, Penrose hammer of ORC or the new proposal that has been made last year by a group of people. I don't remember exactly all the authors. I just remember Christoph Koch was one of them. So.
I guess to add to Francesco's comment about why quantum framework was used here, I think the authors also mention a connection to quantum cognition, and also in the title, it's like cognition to perception, if I'm not misremembering. So quantum cognition is being established, and there are some evidence there. And I think they mention like cognition. You could think of cognition to perception as a continuum if you are into like the embodied cognition kind of literature. So there may be some connections there as well. And I also really like how within this framework, you have a way to formalize and integrate the relationship between qualia and cognitive processes. And instead of looking at qualia as a result of cognitive processes, it's always interacting with each other. And so I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. As you point out, this idea of a continuum between cognitive functions and phenomenal qualities. I think this is one of the big issues that that we face in consciousness science. Like there is always this thought in the back of the head that what we call experience is actually something that is heavily influenced or the byproduct of some cognitive function, but also vice versa, maybe a little bit. So I think it would be very interesting, like, to have a framework that allows you to put them on a continuum, but also just a framework that allows you to characterize the phenomenal aspect of cognition. That would be already really, really great. So yeah, great point, Zoe. Thank you.
I have a comment or question. So I have been thinking about this, but I feel like in the way they formalize this theory, attention is more like a measurement than a state. For example, when they first introduced the indeterminacy of qualia, they used the example of unattended stimuli being indeterminate. If you think about attention as more like a measurement, it actually makes more sense, because turning attention to something is like taking a measurement. And then not turning attention there is not making a measurement, henceforth is indeterminate. But if you consider attention as a state, then it makes no sense to call the experience or qualia of unattended stimuli being indeterminate, because qualia, like qualia given sensory input, the stimuli, and attentional states, they constitute a measurement outcome. So what you are calling indeterminate here is the measurement outcome that is indeterminate, but not the qualia itself. I'm not sure if it makes sense, but I guess to some extent it does.
To me, it makes sense. If I may add something. So in the beginning of Mike's presentation, when you first mentioned indeterminacy, I think you mentioned like eating sweets and then reporting how sweet it is by introspection. So to me, it's like a similar case where before the introspection, you said it's indeterminate. So I understood that as like not that qualia of sweetness itself is indeterminate, but the measurement, like the measure of it, is not determined until you introspect on it and report on it. So I think what I'm hearing from Qianchen is kind of similar.
Yeah, exactly. And introspection is actually like a form of internal attention as well. Like you're paying attention to a certain aspect of your experience, and then it collapses into a determinate state, like the measurement outcome. So yeah, using unattended stimuli being indeterminate itself, it's not really making much sense to me. And yeah, and also I feel like things like attention and introspection should really be in the category of measurement rather than state because of that.
I think when they are talking about state, they are talking about the state of the measurement.
State of the measurement.
So if we think about the measuring a temperature of water, right? The water temperature, observable, sure, whatever. When we're talking about the state, when we're in this case, we're talking about the temperature of the thermostat, the type of the thermostat. How long do you insert the thermostat? These are the states of the measurements.
But yeah, so the state of the measurement is that, you know, you are not paying attention to a stimuli. So you're measuring it, but then it's indeterminate. That's the problem.
I think, well, imagine, maybe I will try this example. Maybe it doesn't work. So for example, let's say, while you're experiencing something, a visual stimuli, let's say, you are not paying attention to some detail. And then afterwards, you will ask a question about that thing. And you're introspect, you're thinking, what do I remember about it? And you realize you haven't paid much attention. Maybe that can be considered as like a unattended stimuli. Does that make sense?
So it's like attention as part of the state of the system is more about where are you attending to, or like to what are you attending to? Right. But then I think introspection might be a bit, maybe it's a bit misleading in that sense because it's more like a measure, but then when you introspect, you might be introspecting about a particular aspect of your experience, and so then that part of it might count as like where are you attending to, and therefore a state of the system or something like that.
Yeah, so there are like something along the lines of two states, right? So first you had the state of attending somewhere at the initial experience, and then after you report, when you report about it, you are paying attention to on top of which. I think the overall issue I have with this idea is that qualia is ontologically different from the state of measurement, but then qualia itself also depends on the state of the measurement. Like, what
so
is qualia in and of itself? Sorry, yeah, okay.
I think that, at least based on my understanding, the idea is that when we are saying, let's say, the level of sweetness, there is no specific level of sweetness before your measurements. So I guess the experience itself exists in some fashion, but the characteristic of it is not there until you ask the question. And it doesn't make sense to talk about how sweet you are experiencing it without mentioning the state of the measurements. Does that help?
Yeah, in the sweetness example, I get it, but then in the attention example, I kind of don't. So that's why I pinpoint attention as something that's really weird in this state, like in this sense.
I definitely see the concern. I think I had this question when it came to like the Zeno effect, testing the Zeno effect with a psychology experiment. I think there's a fundamental difference between quantum physics and quantum-like qualia in that we are like in quantum physics. I don't know anything about quantum physics, full disclosure, but what I assume is when people do make measurements, the measurement taking device is separate from what you are measuring, right? Like the system isn't measuring itself. But then in the case of people and qualia, you are the system that has qualia and you're also the one making the measurement. And so it's inevitable that like the system is making the measurement, so there's some kind of entanglement here, and I'm sure I'm not using that word in the right quantum way, but yeah, I think that's a big difference between the physics framework. Yeah.
I actually had a question related to that, which is in this framework, are they considering this measurement as like this, as Zoe described, this self-measurement, the system measuring its own qualia, or an experimenter measuring the qualia of another system that's not themselves?
Good point.
I think it's about the system. I think it's about both, if you want, but there are two different layers. But definitely, it's also between a system measuring its own qualia.
Or rather, in any of the examples that were used in the paper, what sort of context do they fit into? I think they all fit into this experimenter, an external experimenter measuring a participant's qualia. Is that right, Mike?
Yes, because they are all experiments that they want some kind of behavioral result.
Yeah, so do they bring up some example where they talk about someone measuring their own experience?
There is one example, but not in this paper specifically. I think they want the participant to judge whether they have changed their mind from point 1 to point 2, but they don't want to know the exact judgment of the participant. Yeah, that's the closest I can think of.
Yeah, and to that effect, I actually, that reminds me of a question I had, but I forgot. Is that as experiencers, are we have direct access to our qualia? Like, are we only getting the measurement outcome? And if so, then what even is qualia? How does,
And-
yeah.
And even more importantly, what is we? Because the only thing that maybe gives me a little bit of actually, there are two things. One is that, in a sense, this could resemble a very peculiar, although different than the standard version of higher order theory, right? Where it's basically not about experience, but one very specific kind of metacognition. And the other potential problematic aspect that I am a bit resistant is that exactly as Qianchen just pointed out, the sort of homunculus fallacy, right? Because if we don't have access to our qualia, but only to some kind of measurement outcome, then who exactly is we? Because the measurement the measurement is somewhat felt, right? Because this kind of homunculus fallacy is, I don't know if everyone is familiar with, is this idea that comes from, I think, Descartes, but even probably older, that in a sense you can always explain the mind almost as if there is, like a little pilot homunculus, like it means little man inside the head that is doing his business, right? But then, of course, to explain that person mind, you can do the same. So you have a infinitum regress, and clearly this is not really useful as a scientific explanation. So I'm wondering if, in a sense, like, for example, in integrated information theory, you don't have this issue because the cause-effect structure is both the observer and the observed at the same time, right? In virtue of being the experiential, the whole structure is, right? So even like what you experience, like for example, I'm looking at this phone, right? And this phone that I'm looking at, it's part of my cause effect structure. So it's part of the experience here, all right? So in that sense, you don't have this kind of homunculus fallacy. And I'm wondering if this potentially is a problem for this quantum-like qualia hypothesis, which I don't think it is, because I think maybe it's less about maybe it's less about this kind of clear separation between like what I'm just trying to say is all of this super long and not clear speech is just to say that I don't think this is about pushing the qualia as something that is ultimately unreachable in itself. I think this is how to optimize measurement for qualia, both from the first and the third person perspective. That's my understanding, at least.
So what do you make of the prediction that qualia are sometimes indeterminate then?
I think if you say sometime, makes sense, could make sense. What really matters is what is indeterminate, because I'm not sure, like what I'm not sure, like the even the sweetness one, right? That I'm not sure. I think it's more about the moment you feel the taste feel like something. I don't think you can feel the taste that doesn't feel like anything, and it's not even a taste, because if it's undetermined, like how do you decide which modality it is, right? Like you're already bracketing it, right? So it should be like a most generic kind of quality that I don't even know what it means. On the other hand, something that I always found very interesting is like you cut like a black backpack with the out at the very border of your visual. Yeah. The very border of the visual field, right? And you live with a cat, a black cat, and like 60% of the time you're gonna think that's a cat, right? Or something like that. And then you turn and it's actually a backpack. And then sometimes you turn and it's indeed a cat that is sleeping all the time. So what I'm saying is that sense, maybe, there are two hypotheses. Like you actually saw the backpack, but there is some kind of cognitive gap that doesn't allow you to characterize as a backpack. So the experience is super determined, or the experience is still determined, but let's say something like a Necker cube, or something like more like the Necker cube, like a duck, a duck rabbit, or rabbit duck, right? So something that is both, you experience it both as a backpack and as a cat. And then, of course, when you look better at it, you realize that it's either one or the other. And of course, you can also, I guess, you can claim that this is a kind of indeterminacy, and I think it's acceptable to do so. It makes a lot of sense, and I would be sympathetic to this view. But to say that it's completely unspecific, that's something maybe a bit more problematic for me. Yeah.
I have a sorry. I have a question to ask. What do they mean by indeterminate? Yeah, like, because if by determinate they say it is the categorization that they, for example, there's a category, like there's this black thingy at the back of the mind that is either a black cat or a black backpack, as Francesco example, then that is a very cognitive type of scenario that because category, like we have a certain black qualia, that black shapy thingy that is in the background. That is already qualia itself. So what we're trying to do then when we talk about determinacy or indeterminacy seems to be that we're categorizing it as a cat or as a backpack or as something else. But that is not, I think, qualia as its fundamental core aspect, which is that what we're trying to capture, at least in my perspective, when we're talking about qualia, is just this black shapy sort of like I guess indeterminate in the sense that it is vague, but it is still the qualia itself is still there, definitely. That's my opinion of it. Yeah. So I'm just the question would be like what do they mean by indeterminate qualia?
I think it makes the least sense for me when they say qualia is sometimes indeterminate. I think it makes more sense to either just say qualia is always indeterminate in the sense that any qualia per se is actually the measurement outcome of it, right? You know, like the redness of red you see when you see a red patch is the result of the sensory input red and the state of which you pay attention to it, right? That I can understand. And also you can also go to the other side and say it's always determinate. So that's like the IIT's position, right? You don't have to be able to name it, like have the cognitive appraisal of what that spot black patch is, but it can be a cat or a backpack, but it's there. That's what I'm sure about. But then to say that it is sometimes indeterminate, that is what really confuses me, right? So you are saying sometimes it's determinate, then what is it? So yeah.
I think the issue is experimentally. We are quite sure that at least in some cases it is determinate. So
but then when you're doing experiments, you're measuring it, right? So it's hard to say. Yeah, I know that you know, if you want to put out something as empirically supported, you want to make a very like a weaker statement about your claim, such that you will call it, oh, sometimes qualia is indeterminate. But in the context of this theory, I think it may benefit to be a little bit more bold. It's a hypothesis anyway.
What would be so? I think Qianchen is 100% correct in the sense that even experimentally you cannot prove that it's in certain cases always determined, right? Because there is always, of course, a measurement or an observation before the report. And also, maybe I want to correct my previous statement, also listening to what Qianchen just said. Maybe this is not really a special or very specific kind of higher order theory. Is something a bit new. Is like a first order theory, so something a little bit like a Lamme recurrent processing theory, but with the gist of this measurement outcome that actually collapse or determines the qualia. Maybe something like that. This is just my speculation and has no value for the paper, probably.
Yeah,
just trying to map this.
Yeah, or it's akin to higher order theory, but disagree with it in a sense that the second, like the meta representation in here is the state or like the state of the measurement, right? And then the first order is the qualia. So it is against higher order theory in the sense that it does not need the higher order representation for it to be conscious because qualia is already there. But yeah, I think there are some ambiguity for the QQ hypothesis itself to clarify before comparing itself to other theories.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a somewhat very similar point that I'm a bit uncertain whether QQ hypothesis is more of a set of mathematical tools and structures that allows us to, practically conduct experiments, characterize qualia, and present it. Or is it a theory that try to speak about something that's fundamental about qualia the experience, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And I also wanted to ask that. Because my understanding or my lack of understanding of quantum mechanics or quantum physics is that quantum theory is a completely ad hoc theory. It doesn't it describes what physicists see, but like it doesn't give an understanding of the phenomenon itself. Unlike, say, the theory of general relativity, which like gives a like reasoning as to why you'd expect certain things as at a different level. So yeah, what you said I think is a good point. Is this something which we should take as a tool, as a framework to use when trying to capture or describe qualia experimentally, or is it something that we should use further to try and understand qualia itself? And I think I'd be leaning towards the first case, given what we see in physics so far.
But it could reveal something about qualia itself too, right? In the process of using it as a tool. And I guess like the motivation for using this as a tool is because of the similarities observed in the case of qualia. So maybe there is something there, but I don't think the hypothesis is trying to make a claim that qualia is quantum, but I felt that it's more like agnostic about it so far. And
Yeah,
it could
it
be
says
possible.
quantum-like, right?
Yeah.
Not quantum.
If I may add, I think the trick here is the Bell's inequality that determines whether qualia is indeed indeterminate in a ontological sense or not. If you were in this lab, you may have seen Now talk about it many times. The three polarizer you can put together, so on and so forth. I think the idea is if they can establish a good experiment that shows a violation of the inequality, we will be able to say that, yes, it's ontologically indeterminate in this case, at the very least. But so far, the evidence are quite slim based on my reading of it.
Yeah, on that note, I at the end of the paper, they also, when they talk about the compatibility using Jutha's paradigm, I'll be very excited to see if for example, letters has been found to require attention to see when presented, simultaneously with something else. If you can define a kind of compatible stimuli to letters where you can break this attentional trade-off that you often observe in the letter stimuli, such that you don't need attention to see letters, then I'll be convinced about this compatibility argument. But where is that stimuli? I am not sure if that's likely, to be honest. But we haven't done the experiment, so if it's there, it will be groundbreaking.
Wait, sorry. When you say compatible, is that the same thing as complementary?
Is it the
Right, like
same?
you can't have two at the same time. Like
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in
But-
the yeah.
I guess I was a little confused. I have a comment about this and then another one about the indeterminacy. But for complementary qualia, doesn't bistable perception by itself kind of show complementariness?
Yeah.
Because you can't, with the Necker cube, you can't see both at the same time. Or
Yeah.
maybe I'm like missing something.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
that's sorry, you go.
Wait. You mean the Necker's cube, the two percept are compatible or complementary, or are they not?
They're
I
not.
thought that it wouldn't be complementary because
yeah.
you can't perceive both states at the same time.
Yeah, that's exactly what the QQ is trying to say, right? Some percept are not complementary. They cannot, there's no conjunction probability for both simultaneously. You can only do it one at a time and then flip to another.
Right. Then a clarifying question, then the experiment that Qianchen would be excited to see, like what would that add to this picture?
So yeah, just to give a little bit more clarification. So here their point is the stimuli used in current Jutas paradigm where you find attentional trade-off, for example, letters versus red-green color discs. The reason why when you pay attention to see one thing and then your performance to the other in the periphery will decline is because they are not compatible. So you cannot see them at the same time. If you want to see one thing, you fail at seeing the other.
Mm-hmm.
But what they also make the point is that although these two are incompatible, each of them may be compatible with something else, such that if you use that something else as like the competing stimuli, they will cease to compete against each other. So let's say there's yeah. But I mean, sounds good, may not work. Or you can make the point that maybe in the end, it is just incompatible with like everything else. Then it will also make sense as well. But then that's less exciting. And by the same token, faces which are kind of compatible with each other so that you can see them in central, like in the fovea and periphery without attentional trade-off, it may be incompatible with something else. So that when you pair the two incompatible things together in the dual task, you start to see the attentional trade-off.
I see. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Right. The other, and I hate to kind of bring us back to the indeterminacy issue, but and I might be completely misunderstanding, but they mentioned somewhere the wave function collapse, if anyone remembers. So I kind of understood indeterminacy of qualia in that sense, where it's just like superposition of various qualia, possible qualia that you have at each moment until the moment of measurement by attention to report or whatever, then it kind of collapses down into this thing that you report on. So I guess I thought that it's indeterminate in that sense. And I guess if this is the case, then it would always be indeterminate in the way that Qianchen was raising. But I wasn't sure if I understood that correctly.
I think you're correct. But I guess the question is it always the case or only in some more tricky scenarios? We know, for example, in quantum cognition, not all judgment follows these rules, right? The question is how much of the qualia is indeed indeterminate, which brings us back to our previous discussion about Qianchen's question.
I actually think it may be more convincing to call, like qualia is actually more likely to be the one that's, completely indeterminate in itself than decision making, right? Like you can, yeah, to some extent you can almost make the claim that qualia is always indeterminate or something like that. But then decision making, maybe not. And also provided the and wait, is the decision making that is quantum-like, or the mental state behind the decision making that is quantum-like?
The decision themselves, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, by the way, I was looking through a paper that I recently read about exactly what Qianchen is talking about with a center versus peripheral stimuli, where basically the center task exhausts the attentional resources capacity, and then they are categorizing or measuring peripheral stimuli and their similarity qualia, so to speak. And what they found is that using the center's task as just identifying whether letters are the same or inverted, and then they ask participants to do three types of qualia measurements using, again, letters, or using peripheral disks where you have red-green disks, whether they're rotated or not, or whether the faces are gendered as male or female. And what they have found is that despite the attention is exhausted using the center by the center task, they are still able to identify gender on the peripheral as if there's no attention that or as if there's no center task at all. As in that they're I'm rambling a bit, but basically the qualia structure for gender when the attention is exhausted by the letter task versus not exhausted by the letter task is the same, which sort of show that the two processing, or the two qualia, one being gender of the face, the other being the orientation of the letter, seems to be in this case can coexist, as what Qianchen is asking for.
Is that Elise's paper?
I think so, yes.
Oh.
Yes. Yeah, I was just rereading that. I did it a while ago. So yeah, I may just add the citation so that everyone is following that. Yep.
Yeah, on that note, one would also say that when you are using a scale to measure the similarity, you're making a measurement. Yes.
Oh. That's right.
Yeah, I suppose one of the central question maybe is what is measurement in the QQ hypothesis? What counts as measurement? What doesn't count as measurement?
Yeah.
Yep, I've added that for everyone's reference.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with that. Because so you brought up the example, or they use the example of this color similarity, right? Like depending on which color you present first, you might get an asymmetry in the similarity ratings. And I'm just trying to, I don't know, I don't have the task like in front of me right now, so I can't just try it. But I'm just trying to imagine, like if I see red and then pink versus pink and then red, does the red actually experientially feel different? And I'm not I mean, I'm not trying it right now, so I don't know, but I'm not sure that it does. So I'm just wondering, is this asymmetry a result of this measurement thing rather than the qualia itself being indeterminate?
Yeah, so is it epistemic uncertainty or ontological uncertainty?
I feel
I
like
think
it could
there is.
be.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, please go ahead.
No, please,
Yeah.
please.
I feel like it could be ontological because there is a hidden assumption that even before you look at the pink, there is still some perceptions around, like these sort of scattered like colors, call it like, for example, gray, for example. Like there's a certain color that you see before you see the first color, then the second color. So the question would be, say the first color is gray, then you will have gray, pink, red versus gray, red, pink. In this case, then the color red is contrasted against a gray previous image or a pink previous image. That I think would have some, I feel like that could be different. Yeah, I know it's just a very intuitive idea as I imagined it. Yeah.
Experientially different?
Yes, experientially it could be different because there is a stronger contrast between gray to red versus pink to red. Or maybe I'm extrapolating like a little bit too much here.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense, but there is also another aspect, which is the fact that each experience is intrinsic. So what, I mean, or at least I think they are, but there's good argument for that. But what does it even mean to compare to, like, when we do similarity judgment, that is one experience at one time. So it's the experience of judging the similarities after you've been flashed two dots. It's not the experience of seeing one color and the other color and because it served the purpose of the experiment, right? So what I'm trying to say is, like, even just consider the example, maybe it's a bit better, of time that Mike presented at the very beginning of the presentation, right? They say, well, experience, they do have a fixed duration, we know that, but it's very hard to pinpoint the beginning and the end, right? There is a sense in which experience don't have a duration, where
In what sense?
each experience is eternal, actually, right? From the viewpoint of the experience itself. Like, so the idea in IIT, there is this recent paper that was presented at the summer school and maybe at the Yokohama, Matteo talk about it, the paper about time perception, or time experience, not perception, actually. And the idea of that paper is that the experience of time, at least in IIT, is within one cause-effect structure. So I have one experience, and within that experience, there is a sort of temporal horizon. And then within the next experience, that there is same, but shifted a little bit. So because of that, right, when I am at experience number 5, I have and also probably because I have certain kind of memory, right? I have the feeling of time passing by, or that my experience is going through different time step. But actually, what really is there from my point of view is one experience which has a very little temporal horizon that gives me the feeling of flowing, as they call it in IIT. Everything else is not there, right? Like, literally, phenomenally speaking, there is always only that thing. Now, if you don't even have to endorse IIT, but if just for the sake of argument, like, if you consider IIT that tells you that what exists is what is phenomenally there, that does mean that there is no beginning and there is no end. There is literally only that thing. So I see some perplexity
Wait, so can
in
you
this
tie it
chat.
back to, can you
Yeah,
tie it?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the point. So what I'm trying to say is, like, there is a sense in which you cannot take your experience of a color, like, let's say red, let's say red, and then put that red qualia in your current experience and make a absolute comparison. There is no absolute frame of reference. The frame of reference is always one experience, one specific experience, which is specific, arguably specific, right? So what I think happens is that we have some mechanism to recognize red, because each of these experiences, which are unique, each experience of red is unique, right? But they still have something in common, probably some, if IIT is correct and other intuition are correct, maybe there is some kind of hidden structure within the quality of red, right? So in each time, because I see that kind of similar structure, I recognize it as red, And therefore, I have the feeling, the impression that each red that I see are more or less the same color, but because there is no absolute frame of reference, and I cannot do that, first of all, the question doesn't even make sense because there is no absolute frame of reference, so I cannot compare color in absolute terms. And second, it's literally not possible to take one qualia from that experience and put it in your current experience. So it also practically doesn't make sense. So I think Anson is very much on point with this comment.
I forgot what my point is already, but yeah, thank you for that.
So yeah. I understand that was a bit long argument, but it's an argument which I think most of the time is not really appreciated, but it's actually very important, I think.
So what we can do then is not to well, in your perspective then, where there's only one unitary experience, then what you can only do is to compare that in introspection. You can't compare that sort of like in the phenomenological sense pre-reflectively, like before the reflection of your own phenomenological experience. You cannot compare two of that before you reflect on it. You can only compare two sort of reflected phenomenology in that sense, right?
Yes, but I think not only my picture. I think in more or less every picture you have this kind of issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then can you say that in that sense, all similarity comparisons, like even are going to be ordered in some sense?
Yeah,
Right,
I think it still makes sense, absolutely, especially when you then build some extra structure on that. And I think that actually, very interestingly, I think this is the reason why Ione dilemma is so powerful, because of the intrinsicality of each experience. But also, so what I mean is that regardless of this limitation, you can take a sort of what is called a pragmatic approach and say, well, this is not exactly the same qualia. You cannot make a proper comparison in the perfect sense that you would like to have, but still you can do it. And the reason you can do it is because there is some kind of regularities and matching in experience, right? Experience is not random, and I close my eye, I open the experience, still flow naturally, still matches naturally. So because of all this reason, it actually makes perfect sense to use this kind of approach and many other approaches, by the way. But what I'm talking about is more of a foundational issue, like a foundational constraint on how we think about consciousness, because it has implication for especially functionalist theories, especially attention schema theory. I think I usually think about that. That because they ignore what I was talking about earlier, then it doesn't make any sense, in my opinion, at least.
Wait, sorry, what doesn't make sense?
Theories that usually have a functionalist / use of representation and this kind of thing, they ultimately get to a point where they sort of, I think, intellectually shortcut, and then they don't make any sense. Yeah, I understand this is vague, but either I give a 40-minute talk on the topic, which no one, me first, wants to hear, or or maybe we can talk about another time. I don't want to. I also have to go soon, but I don't want to hijack the meeting. Any other comment, question, observation? Anything that can prevent me to talking?
It's a very naive question, and it's like one of the directions that I thought is worth exploring, or at least I'm trying to explore to see whether it is even viable for deeper research. So you mentioned that the qualia itself is sort of well the pre if I were to use my terminology, like the pre-reflective one, the one that you immediately experience cannot be like compared. What you can only compare is how or your introspected version of the immediate experience. I'm wondering if there could be any correlation between this sort of introspected version to the immediate version, because after all, that is sort of a I don't want to use the word mirror, but it's sort of there should be some correlation between what you introspected as your conscious experience versus the conscious experience, the immediate conscious experience itself. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense at all at this stage, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I think I meant something different. What I
okay.
meant is you can definitely, I think you can compare the qualia you're experiencing now with the qualia you experienced 5 minutes ago, but only within the frame of reference of the now experience. Let's say for sake of argument, you have an experience at time zero, t0, and t minus 1. Okay, at t minus 1 you see red, at t minus 2 you see blue. And I think you can definitely compare red and blue for sure. Obviously, we do that all the time, right? But what is important to appreciate, I think, is that you're not comparing in absolute term red and blue. You are at t0 comparing the blue you are experiencing in some way with the red you are experiencing in some way, which is probably memory, introspection, or whatever, which is not necessarily the red that you experienced at t minus 1. That's in essence what I was trying to say. And that applies not just to color or to this, but to every experience, because every experience is I think every experience is self-contained, and every experience is ultimately intrinsic. That's the word we use in IIT.
Can you clarify what that means? Sorry.
No,
because I'm a little bit confused. Like, what do you mean by the absolute sense versus the relative sense?
So maybe I hope this is not confusing, but I think this is the crucial and fundamental difference between consciousness and everything else, right? So how does it work? If you think about it, like imagine you are someone who lived many years ago. You look at the sky every night and you see a star, and then you look at the sky every morning and you see a star, right? Or something like that. I don't remember now.
I see.
And then after many observation and then thinking and measurement, you realize they're actually the same thing, right? The same planet, right? And you can do that because you are, so to say, an external observer who sees two things and make all the try to make a mapping between these two things, so to say, and establish a mapping, and then the mapping is an identity. Consciousness doesn't work this way, because consciousness is a sort of self-observation, is a self-loop. It's not, when you try to compare two experience, is one system observing itself and maybe remembering about another experience, but you cannot have a neutral vantage point like the guy that look at the planets and realize they're the same, because, so to say, a third-person perspective, if you want to use this term, but because it's everything from not just the first-person perspective, but it's literally the observation itself, you have this completely different setting when it comes to consciousness rather than when it comes to anything else. That's
so it's
the
like
main point.
Okay. So it's like observing, if you were to use an analogy, I think, like observing like the movement of planets on a stable ground, or realizing that you're actually moving and actually the frame of reference is also moving because of how experience evolves. Okay, I see.
Perfect. Actually, the important thing, I think, that the moment we will reach and I think I'm not sure, but we talk a lot about this, so I think maybe now agrees, but I don't want to put words in his mouth, is that we basically had three relative revolution, right? So the first one, when we understood that the Earth is not at the center of the solar system. The second, when we understand that the relativity theory, right? And the third one, I think, will be consciousness, where each experience is absolutely relative. In that very absolute sense, not just a explanatory sense, in the very ontological absolute sense. I'll zip it.
So then in that sense, broadest qualia, like your single moments of experience, we call it right now broad qualia, but it's like the narrowest one. And narrow qualia that you get, like perception of red or perception of blue, those are you get them through many experiences, like those reference points of seeing instances of reds and instances of blues. So in that sense, it's kind of like the broadest.
Yeah. But it's just using the use of word narrow and broad is just to be commonsensically, or like try to make the idea more intuitive. But by definition, it's the other way around, which is very interesting.
Kind of similar in the QQ hypothesis, right? In some fashion, that the state is almost always unique in some way, either because of the time point or the spatial location or whatever. So the only way to consider the qualia of red is to collect an ensemble of redness in a similar state. And then you can sort of get a statistical understanding about what redness is. That's quite interesting.
Is there a term for what's the term for that? What you just described? Is there a I don't know.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. No.
Okay.
All right. So if there are if there are comments, please ask, but kind of last opportunity. And if not, we can probably end this section, but we went a little bit longer than usual, maybe. We're good? Okay, so let's thank again our presenter, Mike, who made an outstanding job. Thank you so much. And thank you, Zoe, Angus, Anson, and Qianchen for participating. And thank you for the people, if any, that are watching this video. And if you resisted to this point, thank you so much. You're the real hero. See you to the next episode.